For what purpose from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass S-854, the Methamphetamine Response Act of 2021.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 854, an act to designate methamphetamine as an emerging threat and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, and the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. GUTHRIE, will control 20 minutes, each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on S-854.
Without objection.
And, Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise in support of S-854, the Methamphetamine Response Act of 2021. Today, our nation continues to face a devastating epidemic of substance use and overdose deaths, an epidemic that has only been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. During the pandemic, we have surpassed the tragic milestone of 100,000 drug overdose deaths in a one-year period. Although opioids account for a significant number of overdose deaths, methamphetamine overdoses have been rising at alarming rates in recent years. Recent data from the National Institutes of Health found that methamphetamine overdose deaths nearly tripled from 2015 to 2019. Further, the Drug Enforcement Administration reports that methamphetamine continues to be readily available throughout the United States. In 2019, the DEA seized over 53,000 kilograms of methamphetamine. That was a 55% increase over 2018. Recent data also suggests that seizures of methamphetamine have increased during the pandemic. The threat of this drug is compounded by the common mixing or cutting of drugs, such as cocaine, with methamphetamine. To address the widespread availability and the shocking increases in methamphetamine-involved overdose deaths, this legislation would designate methamphetamine as an emerging drug threat. By making this designation, Mr. Speaker, S-854 would require the Office of National Drug Control Policy to implement a methamphetamine response plan. And as part of this plan, ONDCP and partner agencies would develop a comprehensive assessment of the emerging drug threat, establish quantifiable goals to combat the threat, implement performance measures, and identify the funding levels needed to implement the plan. The House companion of this bill was considered and passed by the Energy and Commerce Committee with bipartisan support in July of last year. I commend the sponsors of the House companion, Representative Peters and Curtis, for their leadership. This legislation is another step forward in our ongoing efforts to end the substance use epidemic that is devastating our families and communities. And so, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support S-854, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserved. For what purpose is the gentleman from Kentucky?
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of S-854, Methamphetamine Response Act.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of S-854, Methamphetamine Response Act. The companion version of this bill, H.R. 2051, was led by Representatives Peters, Curtis, Harshbarger in the House. Methamphetamine is a highly addictive stimulant that is illicitly trafficked throughout the United States. This dangerous substance is associated with psychosis, cardiovascular dysfunction, infectious disease transmission, and overdose. The Drug Enforcement Administration even issued a public safety alert for the first time in 6 years in September 2021, warning Americans about the increase in the lethality of fake prescription pills containing fentanyl and methamphetamine. In response to recent trends and alarming increases in methamphetamine-involved overdose deaths, S-854 would designate methamphetamine as an emerging drug threat that would direct the Office of National Drug Control Policy to develop a methamphetamine response plan. The development and the implementation of this plan will help coordinate efforts across the federal government to more effectively address the emerging drug threat. And I'll say we absolutely have to have this in place, but it stops at the source. I was able in early January to go to the border, and I was outside of El Paso, actually in New Mexico, but outside of El Paso, And the Border Drug Agents said, because they took me to the point where they finished on January 20th, 21, where they ceased building the wall. And they said this is where a lot of the drugs are flowing through. And they were talking about meth, and they were also talking about fentanyl. And fentanyl, as we know, is mostly originates in China, comes through Mexico. So it's just a failure of so many different policies, comes through Mexico and comes through the border. And they said because of the volume of people coming up through the border without the Remain in Mexico policy and the wall, that it's numbers. If hundreds of people are coming, we can catch 20% of them. And you can put fentanyl particularly. I know we're talking about methamphetamine, but it goes together. You can put fentanyl in a water bottle and bring it through. And then we're doing this bill, which is great today. But illicit fentanyl analogs, on March the 11th, if the CR expires, will be street legal in the United States. This committee needs to bring the HALT Fentanyl Act to the floor and permanently ban illicit fentanyl. 70% of all overdose deaths in Kentucky in 2020 was from illicit fentanyl. So rise in support of this bill. This is a serious bill. I actually had a sheriff from Nelson County, Kentucky, was visiting, and he said, we can tell the price because they do the control buys. And the amount of money I have to use to buy meth, the cost I can tell you what's happening at the border, because if it's low, it means we're flooded with it because the border's not in control. And right now, the price is so low. The only thing that my drug enforcement officers have said to me is that, well, there's no longer any meth labs, or many meth labs, if any, in rural Kentucky because so much is coming from Mexico, it's put them out of business. So they don't have to go clean up meth labs as they find them. But it's a tough consolation. So we need to pass this bill, and we also need to pass the HALT Fentanyl Act, and we need to get control of our southern border to keep them from flowing into this country illegally to begin with. And with that, I yield back and reserve my time.
Does the gentleman wish to reserve?
I reserve my time.
Reserve. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no additional speakers, so if you want to close.
No additional speakers, and I'll yield back.
Gentleman from Kentucky yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would just urge a support for this bill, which is bipartisan, so we can send it to the President, and I yield back.
Gentleman from New Jersey yields back. The question is, will the House suspend rules and pass Senate 845? 854. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.